Hi, folks. Nathan here. I am excited to have a two-part series to present to you in the next couple of weeks of the podcast, where we're going to be talking with Israel Wayne, who is a author, homeschool speaker. You can learn more about him at his website, familyrenewal.org. Some of the books he has written include Education Does God Have an Opinion? And Answers for Homeschooling. So I would encourage you to check out those resources, but also I hope you are encouraged and blessed by this two-part series with Israel on our podcast. So with that, uh, enjoy, and thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the Front Line with FPM, where we talk about California politics, homeschool freedom, parental rights, and the family. I'm your host, Nathan Pierce, and thanks for joining us today. Let's jump right in and see what's going on here on the Front Line. Well, thank you, folks, for joining us today. I'm thankful to have Israel Wayne, my friend from Michigan. Thanks for joining us today, Israel.
Thank you, Nathan. It's great to be here.
I want to go into some of the attacks on homeschooling over the last few months and weeks, particularly as to how I wanted to start with how they are going after homeschooling and some of the ways that it's considered to be unregulated in your state, particularly. Some of the articles that we've seen tie sort of California to Michigan, which is why I thought of you, particularly how you were interviewed by Washington Post, particularly, and some others, because of how some of the articles being written about homeschooling have sort of pointed towards some ideas about legislation or additional regulation. So how has that kind of prompted things in your neck of the woods, and what's sort of the status of that at this point?
Well, I think we have to step back a little bit and acknowledge that there has been a campaign against homeschooling from its beginning, and it's had different reiterations. I remember, I believe it was in the 1990s, there was a push by CBS television. They had come out with, I think, an episode of Law and Order that I'm probably getting some of my facts messed up, but there was maybe Law and Order was a different network, but there was a Law and Order episode where they had some homeschoolers that were abusing their kids, and they did a whole feature called The Dark Side of Homeschooling that was pushing an abuse narrative that homeschoolers are child abusers. And we've seen it pop up here and there in different times and places. There was another situation, I think, was in the 2000s, perhaps, or maybe even in the early 2010s, where there was some homeschool authors who had written a child training book, and there were 4 homeschooling families that were in court that they were accusing of beating their children to death, which I think happened, but they were saying that this was them following the teachings of these homeschooling leaders. So that was national news story. And then we had a situation here in Michigan in 2015 in Detroit. There was a mother who had killed her 2 children, had put them in the freezer, and there for, I think, a year or so before anybody found out that they were dead. That certainly created a national stir related to homeschooling. The news media, was all over that, calling for regulations. We had a bill that was introduced at that time in Michigan by a Democratic legislator named Stephanie Chang, calling for regulations in Michigan. In California, you had the Turpin family case, which the media nationally dubbed the House of Horrors story. And so, there's been a lot leading up to this. I think that to kind of be, act like this is a brand new thing on the horizon would be wrong. The media has been building a narrative for quite some time. In September, Amazon put out a documentary series that I've been told was the most watched documentary in the history of Amazon Prime.
Mhm.
It's, I think, called Shiny Happy People.
Mhm.
That was about sort of a conservative fundamentalist side of the Christian homeschooling movement, and they went after some key figures, some of whom have been disgraced and are no longer considered leaders in the homeschool movement, but that were at a time in the past. And they went after groups like Homeschool Legal Defense Association and Generation Joshua, and then other organizations that are involved in training teens for civics, like Impact, and some of these organizations were named specifically. And they had a lot of homeschooled former homeschooled graduates who came on to basically promote a narrative that homeschooling is a cover for child abuse and neglect. So this kind of thing has been happening for a while, but really, I would say since 2022, the Washington Post has just been, I don't even know the adjectives to use, but they've just been on a campaign to try to portray homeschooling in as negative a light as they possibly can through many different facets, channels, angles, whatever metaphor to use there. And they've done a whole series of articles. I don't know if it's 10, 12, something like that. So quite a few articles, some of which have been more negative than others, but most of which have been deeply negative towards homeschooling and promoting it as being abusive in various ways, in terms of it being a kind of spiritual, psychological abuse, academic neglect, physical abuse of children, that homeschooling is just rampant. And I was interviewed for 2 of the articles. Actually, I was interviewed 3 times by the Washington Post. One of the interviews, they didn't use anything. I talked an hour and a half. They didn't use anything I said. But 2 other interviews, I had quotes published in the Washington Post. And it's interesting when you have people who are journalists who are doing something like this. It's that they promote the idea that they're just following journalistic integrity and that they're completely unbiased in this series, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't think hardly anyone who read the series from either side of the political aisle would say that it's without bias. I mean, I just don't think anybody would
yeah,
view it that way. And so, yeah, it's been. But as far as motivation of what motivates it, obviously you can't get into somebody's head, and assign motives to an individual's heart and mind. But if you look at things they've said, one of the things that they've said is that they are concerned about how this promotes things that they would consider to be Christian nationalism. They did a whole article on that.
right, right.
And those that are particularly involved in the political sphere, because they see homeschooling as being tied into kind of religious right politics. And while it's not in any way, absolutely categorically not connected to any political party at all, they see it as being more aligned with one political party than another.
Right.
There's
Which
homeschoolers from everywhere, right?
right,
But
yeah, and I'm sure there's a large uh group of homeschoolers in California that would take great offense at being
correct.
lumped in with that group.
Correct. Yes. But anyway, but I think that's a concern that they have, is
Yeah,
that these homeschoolers, many of them are growing up with conservative ideas and conservative values and religious, specifically Christian values, and that seems to be something they object to. At least that's what their narrative indicates, if you look at
yeah,
the things they say.
yeah. And it seems um uh, like you said, some are a little bit stronger. Some of these articles are stronger than others. Some of them are really intense. Um,
Mhm.
they're, the article, well, let's just talk about it. The article from a few days ago, talking about Dr. Brian Ray. who you and I both know and have for some time. There's some attacks there that are uh, pretty ugly from the way I look at it. I think anybody looking at that would kind of be surprised to the extent to which they would attack him, especially people that know him. But there's some attacks there. There's several different angles in even that article that's just focused on Dr. Ray and um his academic presentations, his journal, his studies that he's done over the years. He's presented a lot over the years that weren't studies that he did. They were studies other people did, but he has a journal that happens to publish other people's studies. I mean, let me ask you about fairness in that article. I mean, as far as just looking at the academic aspects of it, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's obviously two ways that they attacked Dr. Brian Ray in that article. The one was professionally, and the other was personally.
Mm-hmm.
And from my viewpoint, I understand if you're just trying to create a case against someone, that the ad hominem to the man argument can be compelling in the public sphere. But from a professionalism standpoint, they actually found one of his children to say negative things about him personally, about how they perceived him as a parent. And that's just dirty. I mean, that's just low.
Yeah.
To resort to that. Most major media sources would not do that even with a political candidate. I mean, you look at how the liberal media in particular has disassociated Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, for example, right?
Sure.
You know,
Yeah.
that they've not sought to try to exploit what could be, you know, perhaps a painful relational context. They've you know, maintained, I think, an approach that we will deal with the president on his own merits, and look at his policies. And so I think if they were going to attack Dr. Ray's academic research and question it and call it into question as far as validity, I would say journalistically, you know, that's fair game. I think a newspaper has a right to do investigative journalism if they believe that someone is publishing research that's academically flawed.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
this particular article was not of that nature. This was let's just grab any kind of bit of negative information that we possibly can and throw it all into a soup in a big anti-Dr. Brian Ray article. I found it very offensive. I did not find it to be professional. Absolutely was not unbiased journalism in any way, shape, or form. And if you want to be fair, I mean, I'm actually friends with one of Dr. Ray's oldest children. I've known Dr. Ray for many years, but I had a personal conversation with this other child of Dr. Ray's some months back. And this other child does not share that perspective at all. In fact, is 180 degrees in the opposite direction of the one that they chose to feature for the article. So again, if we want journalistic fairness and integrity, you know, well, I don't think that kind of a line of argumentation is appropriate at all in an article on his academic merits. The fair thing would have been to say, this one child is unhappy with the experience that they had as a child with this person. But on the other hand, we talked to these other 6 that are fine with it. And, you know, it feels like that would have been more a complete narrative if it's just like, hey, we're just telling you everything we know about this person.
Right.
As far as the academic aspects, I'm not a researcher, and so I'm not qualified to speak to whether or not Dr. Ray's methods, you know, could be called into question from a level of scrutiny. But I will say this, that to find a researcher from an Ivy League school or some prestigious university who ideologically hates homeschooling, and to get them to give you a quote that says this researcher whose research supports homeschooling is a fraud, doesn't make it a fraud. I mean, how is it less ideologically driven to have someone who is against homeschooling that will just call out their opponent, ideological opponent, and question their merits? And I will say that to his credit, in all the years I've known Dr. Ray has never approached academics in that way. He has never sought to malign the academic pedigree or even the methods of other researchers, if he believes that they were sincerely going about their work in a professional way and just came up with a different narrative or a different result. He will say, I've heard him say many times, this one study over here didn't seem to show homeschooling in such a positive light. And we have 5 studies over here that do. And so what we do as academics is we put them all together and we try to balance it. And we say, well, there's one over here that showed maybe even a slightly negative narrative, but then these 5 seem to counter that. So we put it all together, and it still seems to tip in the balance of homeschooling. And the publication that he produces is a compilation of lots of homeschool research, not just Dr. Ray's research, and he constantly cites other studies and other academicians, and he has had peer-reviewed journal articles published in peer-reviewed journals that are not just him, promoting his idea. He's had to submit to the rigors of academia to have these published. And so I felt that from, what I know of the research that he does, and the procedures that he's followed, that he has submitted to the same rigors of study as everybody else. And is he personally biased toward homeschooling? Yes. Are the people who have done studies that have found negative results of homeschooling biased against homeschoolers personally? I don't know. I will say there are academicians like Elizabeth Bartholet from Harvard who called for a presumptive ban on homeschooling. I know she's biased against homeschooling, right?
Right.
And so I've actually asked Dr. Ray about this just personally because I'm not a researcher. And so I've asked him, how do you keep inherent personal bias out of the research? And he said, well, bias, and this is true of journalists and newspaper reporters as well, bias is inherent.
Right.
Everybody has bias. Everybody has a perspective. Everybody has, this whole idea of modernity, that people don't have a perspective or they don't have any a priori assumptions, is categorically false. But you have to be willing to submit to the data. And Dr. Ray has always done that. And I've worked with him not as a professional, but as a layperson on a number of projects over the year. Participated in a conference called the Gen 2 conference that was based on a publication he did called the Gen 2 survey. I think that was like back in maybe 2012. Was actually communication with him a lot for a study he did called Homeschooling Grows Up, which I think was 2009. Mm-hmm. And in all of these studies, he has never hidden information that would be negative towards homeschooling.
Right.
If it's there, he puts it in the research. He publishes it. He shows that given these particular conditions, this actually can have an adverse effect on a homeschooling outcome. And so I think the fact that he's had to submit to the same rigors as everybody else, he's gone through the peer review process. He has worked with multiple scholars from lots of different backgrounds, not just those who are homeschoolers. I trust his research. I think he's done a fabulous job, and his research correlates to the research that has been done on homeschooling by lots of other professionals. The vast majority of research compiled about homeschooling has been overwhelmingly positive. The few reports that have shown negative trends or have been somewhat negative are very few. And so in the mix of all of that, with all of these other researchers who didn't get called out, who didn't get
Right.
attacked and didn't
Right.
have their credentials questioned, his is right in the middle with all of the rest of them.
Hmm.
And so if he's using some sort of unethical approach to his research, he still landed right where everybody else did for the most part.
Right.
So it just doesn't, the arguments don't make sense to me. Again, as a layperson, it doesn't make sense to me how they're calling his research less than stellar. I don't follow. Even reading the article, I saw that they didn't like him. That's what I
Yeah.
saw.
Yeah.
But I didn't see arguments that were compelling to me.
Right. And he's, like you said, he's not alone. I just counted on the masthead for his journal, The Homeschool Researcher, and there's 11 other PhDs besides him that are weighing in and reviewing these studies that they publish. And so it's not like Dr. Ray is some sort of just lone wolf out there, lone person just doing his own thing. He's not
Yes.
He's not doing this by himself. He's got other people looking over what he's doing. Plus, like you said, there's other studies out there that have kind of landed in the same place that they're not working for Dr. Ray. They're people outside. We're talking other people
Yes.
from other organizations.
People
So
who have no personal connection to homeschooling whatsoever.
yeah.
And they've done studies. I remember one of the first studies that ever came out about homeschooling was in the late 1980s by a guy, if I'm remembering my history right, but named Dr. Gary Knowles out of the University of Michigan. And in the late 80s, no one knew anything about homeschooling. And so I think his first studies were interviewed, like 13 people who had been homeschooled, which was almost impossible. These are people who were homeschooled like back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And it was mostly anecdotal because you just didn't have 1,000 people that you could, you could survey. And this guy had just zero connection to homeschooling. He just found it to be an interesting topic. And even back then, before homeschooling was even a thing or was a movement, they just found some really phenomenal positive outcomes from home education. And so there have been plenty of those researchers that have, over the years, just been interested out of curiosity, who are not personally invested one way or the other. And overwhelmingly, homeschooling has shown itself to be, on average, very positive. We will concede. Nathan and I are homeschool graduates. We should probably confess that.
Right.
Full disclosure, right? So that that doesn't come out as a scandal. Somewhere that we hid and suppressed that. So we both are, kind of biased because we have our own experience with it. But we will both concede that there are students who went through the process of being homeschooled that don't appreciate their experience.
Yeah.
They're out there. We know them. And so we don't want to say that homeschooling has been a phenomenal experience for everyone who's been through it. But on the average, it has, and again, you average it all out, average out the research, average out the numbers, average out the homeschool graduates. It's been an overwhelmingly positive experience.
Yeah. I definitely 100% agree with that. And I think it's important to recognize that there are definitely people with the bias on the other side of this that are kind of going after whatever they can,
Yes.
like you mentioned in the articles that we've seen. And in fact, pushing towards more regulation as a response to that. There's been some discussion in your area. It's my understanding there's not currently a bill, but there's talk. Is that accurate?
Correct. That's correct. So basically, like within a couple of days of the Washington Post article being published, calling for regulations of homeschooling in Michigan because of alleged abuse, our Attorney General picked up, so she issued a press release saying she was going to go after two families who were part of the foster care system and had adopted children out of foster care, and she's accusing them of some really egregious abuse.
Hmm.
And and then there was a politician in Michigan, Representative Matt Kolzar, and he posted a tweet saying that Michigan is only like one of 11 states in the United States that does not have a mandatory reporting law, and he's saying, we need to fix this. I'm not quoting him directly, but that was the gist of his tweet. And then Attorney General Dana Nessel in Michigan came out with a statement as well, saying homeschoolers who are hiding behind abuse, and that needs to be fixed. Or there are people who are abusers who are hiding behind the homeschool laws. I'm sorry, I think that's how she put it.
Sure.
And so ironically, just within a couple of days of that, I got a call from a reporter at the Washington Post who asked me, do you have any ideas why there could be a suggestion of an introduction of new legislation in Michigan at this time?
Oh my goodness. Wow.
And so I said,
huh.
yes, I said, well, it's really interesting and ironic you would ask that question, because me personally, I think a lot of it has to do with a very significant article on this very topic that just was published in the Washington Post. And so, and so, I'm not going to say it was gloating, but it was interesting timing on the part of the Post to wonder about the correlation. And so there is, I think, a sense in which when stories like that publish, they pull on a lot of heartstrings, and they also motivate a lot of politicians who feel like, okay, I could capitalize on this, and I could win a lot of favor with my constituents if I show myself as being anti-child abuse. I want to comment, and I understand it's just a Michigan issue, but I just want to comment on a couple of things related to the prosecution of these two families. Yeah. Because I started to wonder, I did some research into it, because I started to wonder, how is this even a homeschool story? Because in Michigan, legally, you can't homeschool foster children. Okay. So, why is this being a call for regulation of all homeschoolers in Michigan if it's foster children? I found out that at least one of the families had adopted some children out of the foster care system and had homeschooled the adopted children after they were adopted. But as I got looking into it farther, I was very surprised to find out that in May of this year, both of these families had been investigated, and there's a connection between the two. They know each other and have a connection, which I'll try to explain in a minute. But they had been investigated, and all charges against both families were dropped in May of 2023 by the state of Michigan for lack of evidence. And so the families have been essentially cleared by the state of Michigan since May. Now in early December, that has been picked back up personally by the Attorney General, who's going after both families. And to our knowledge, there hasn't been any new information. There's no new cases. There's no new, nothing has happened in that interim. And so apparently she is trying to pick up and go after them again after something that the state of Michigan already investigated and dropped. Right. Both families saying that there's not. It's also interesting that one of the older daughters of the Flore family has gone very public, or is trying to go public, and to give an opposing narrative, saying, I grew up in the family and these allegations are false. I was not abused. And she's trying to get her voice into the media to be able to say these are not true charges. And she has given some reasons why she thinks that this is more politically motivated, and in some cases perhaps even personally motivated, than it being actual cases of abuse. One thing that I have argued with the media, and related to this investigation, is one of the fathers, Mr. Brown, actually worked for the Department of Health and Human Services and was by occupation a Child Protective Services investigator. So Mr. Colzar, our representative who is calling for regulations, is saying that Michigan's lacks homeschool laws that do not require mandatory annual notification or registration have allowed situations like this to go on where child abuse is happening because they don't have the ability to investigate these lost children because they're missing and they don't know where they are. There's nothing about that makes any sense at all in relationship to these two families. Because when you're in the foster care system, you're deeply connected to CPS.
Right. You know
and
where they
one of
are.
the fathers is employed by CPS. So it feels like this is far more personal than factual.
Yeah.
These are not unknown quotients. And as the daughter for the Flores family has pointed out, these children spent most of their lives in traditional schools, including public schools, that they're not unknown to the system. They're very known, extremely known to the system. And in fact, I'll just throw this out there too. Our Attorney General, Dana Nessel, is very publicly, I mean, if you go to her Twitter page, you'll see it on her bio. She's very publicly lesbian. And the agency through which these two families adopted in Michigan is a Catholic adoption agency named St. Vincent's. And they do not allow LGBTQ families to adopt through their agency.
I see.
And Attorney General Nessel had previously tried to prosecute St. Vincent's to force them to accept LGBTQ adoptions. And this daughter from the Flore family, who is married to a son from the Brown family, that's the connection, she became a very vocal public face of opposition to this prosecution against St. Vincent's. So she just believes that this is more of a kind of personal retaliation sort of situation than an actual child abuse. And I'm not saying whether, I don't know these families personally, but I will say that the media has pushed this out as there are these horrible cases of child abuse that have taken place, and these families have been basically tried and convicted by the media, which is not where this needs to take place. It needs to happen by the courts, right? That's our system of prudence says that someone is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law.
Right.
And there's been no court that has convicted these families. The state of Michigan dropped all charges saying there wasn't evidence. So anyway, there's some really nefarious conditions related to even the premise of why we have to go after these families. But two things. Number one, these were not lost children. They're very known to the system. Let's say, worst case scenario, that there was child abuse in these families. This mandatory registration obviously did not keep them safe. Having a child's name on a government database clearly did not protect these children from child abuse, if abuse indeed happened. And so we believe that, again, there's nothing about having a mandatory registration that will prevent child abuse. Another argument I used with the Washington Post is they ran an article about a child who was raised part of his life in Michigan, moved to California, who was killed by his stepmother in California. And they conceded in the article that they were not real homeschoolers. They said that in the article. The mother was not actually homeschooling, but she was keeping them home, and telling people she was homeschooling. And he's saying, wouldn't it be worth mandatory registration of all homeschoolers in Michigan if it saved one life? What if it saved the life of this one child? Wouldn't it be worth having all homeschoolers in Michigan have to register? And I reminded him, California has a law where you incorporate as a private school, and so you're notifying the state of your intent to homeschool they call them ISPs.
A private school. It's a private school, or you can join an ISP or a PSP as a member of a larger group. Yes,
but there's a sense in which you register in California, and I reminded him of the Turpin case, which he was not familiar with, surprisingly. But I said, in California, we've had a couple of situations where there was egregious abuse, and we had a homicide in California, and California has laws where homeschoolers register, And people who are lawbreakers and child abusers do not obey laws.
Right.
So they will do one of two things. They will not register and keep abusing their child, or they will register and keep abusing their child because criminals don't obey laws. That's kind of the basis of it. And so there just is no scenario where having a child on a government database makes sure that a child is not abused. And I want to be very clear. I mean, Nathan and I are totally 100% opposed to any and all child abuse.
Yeah.
And anyone who is convicted of child abuse needs to be prosecuted using the laws that exist in all 50 states that deal with child abuse. And I believe that the laws in all 50 states are quite adequate related to child abuse, at least the ones I've seen.
Yeah.
And so, our view is that the state needs to do their job and need to follow up on cases where child abuse is reported. But to divert resources and time and funds and man hours away from known reports of child abuse to do what Stephanie Chang was suggesting here in Michigan in 2015 of having potentially mandatory visits with social workers for homeschoolers. That's going to harm children.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
It's not going to keep them safe.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
You don't want to witch hunt against homeschoolers. You have to spread these social workers out now to investigate. In Michigan, we estimate we have about 50,000 homeschool students. California, I think, has far more. To try to go find all these children and investigate them, it would just deplete much needed resources away from investigations of children who are, in many cases, very much in danger.
Right.
It's just, there's no way on a public policy level that any of this makes any sense. From an ideological framework, it makes sense.
Right.
And if you have an ideological opposition to homeschooling, then yes, that makes sense, but it doesn't within any other framework.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's fair to say, at least in California, I imagine it may be the case in Michigan, we are struggling with our social services just being overwhelmed with all of these reports that they don't have all of the manpower they need to investigate the current reports that they get.
Absolutely. And most of those are related to students who are in the public schools.
Right.
And frequently it's related to abuse that has happened in the public school.
Right.
The Washington Post themselves, I believe, said in one of their articles about Michigan that the number one reason people were homeschooling was because of bullying in the public schools. So the idea that if we take these children out of a homeschool context and we put them into a public school, that will keep them safe is completely fallacious.
Right.
Public schools are some of the most dangerous places that a parent can place a child physically.
Right.
As well as, I think a lot of other ways too, psychologically and certainly spiritually, if you're a Christian or even frankly, Orthodox Jewish or Muslim or, someone who believes in, a strong monotheistic faith, you're going to have your faith undermined within that system. And so, but particularly from a physical standpoint, there was a case, there was a story in the Chicago Tribune came out, I think it was 2017, where they had found that there were over 500 reports of child sexual abuse within Chicago public schools, most of which were never investigated by Child Protective Services. And when they asked CPS why they never investigated, they said, we just don't have enough resources to investigate all of the reports we get from the public school. And these were students who were sexually abused by fellow students, by school faculty, by teachers, principals, so on school property during school hours. And so to tell me that a child is safe in public school and not safe in the care of their own parents is totally fallacious. Now, are there a few families here and there that abuse children within the homeschool community, yes, there are people who abuse children in every subculture that there is.
Right.
You can find any kind of demographic and you will find people who abuse children. It's sad, it's tragic. But is there a disproportionately high percentage of child abuse that happens within homeschooling contexts? Absolutely not. There's a lot of research on that. You can go to a website called homeschoolingbackgrounder.com. They have a lot of research on that topic. Also, Dr. Brian Ray's website, NHERI, NHERI.org, has done a lot of research on that. You can look up his studies that link to other studies. Again, if you don't trust his studies, go to people completely unrelated to him who are not on the payroll of NHERI, who have done correlative studies on child abuse and homeschooling, and there's not a connection. Again, one study showed that students who were homeschooled are 257% less likely to be sexually abused than students who go to public school. That's a significant decrease. They also found that when students who were homeschooled experienced sexual abuse, it was usually not in the context of the home. It was in the context of some sort of out of the home activity, maybe a sports team or some kind of a school activity that they participate in, or some kind of a community or civic meeting that they're involved in. That's not, or sometimes maybe visiting friends, at their home or something like that. But rarely was it connected to abuse that actually happened within the home. So there's a bias that people don't like homeschooling. They suspect homeschooling, and it is driven mostly, I think, by media reports. And these very biased articles that publications like the Washington Post have produced.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Front Line with FPM. For more information about the topics we discuss here, check out Family Protection Ministries at fpmca.org and subscribe to our channel.